Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. The United States was all set to carry out military strikes against Iran this week. American President Donald Trump himself tweeted to say that his military was cocked and loaded, prepared to hit 3 sites in the Islamic Republic, a move that would have potentially killed 150 people. Just 10 minutes before the strike was supposed to happen, Trump said he decided to call off the operation. With tensions between the US and Iran running so high, many are wondering whether the US is going to repeat a tragic historical mistake a decade and a half after it bombed its way into a disastrous war against Iraq. It's impossible to say for certain if there is going to be a war, but the events of the past few days have certainly increased the chances of some sort of conflict. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will take a closer look at the crisis in West Asia. Joining me on the program today are Meera Shankar, former ambassador, Professor Swaran Singh, School of International Studies, JNU, and Wail Awad, West Asia expert. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. So, what's happening between the US and Iran, and what's at stake for leaders of both the nations?
Well, I think tensions have really rocketed and they're on the threshold of what could prove to be an escalation in hostilities. It started actually with the withdrawal of the US from the nuclear deal, as President Trump had promised, and the reimposition of sanctions against Iran. Iran has, of course, said that while it earlier continued to abide by the deal, it has now said that unless the Europeans step up to ease the sanctions which have been put into effect by the US, Iran will not adhere to certain elements of the nuclear deal, including the limits for the stockpile of low enriched uranium, and that later on it might start enriching uranium beyond the low enriched threshold. So Iran is also gradually stepping up the pressure on US allies to either adhere to the waiver of sanctions which was implicit in the deal, or face the possibility that Iran could gradually renege from the agreement. There have been incidents in the Gulf against oil tankers. The US says it is Iran which was involved. Iran refutes this. There's no clear evidence as to who was behind these. And most recently there was the shooting down of an unmanned drone by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Again, the Iranians say that it was in defense and that it was over their airspace, whereas the US says it was in over international waters. Now, in response to that, the US prepared contingency plans for military strikes against 3 targets in Iran, as you said. And in the meanwhile, they had already escalated their military deployments in the Gulf, 1,500 troops, aircraft carrier, surveillance aircraft, and so on. But at the last minute, I think President Trump called it off. And while he said that it was because it would not be proportionate, since it would lead to the death of 150 people, it obviously underlines that the president himself has doubts about the possibility of this then leading to a longer term military entanglement in Iran, which is something he has always criticized and said that it's a waste of American treasure and American lives, and that the US needs to get out of this and focus on building its economy. So clearly,
better sense seemed to have prevailed really in this particular instance.
So clearly his aides were pushing for retaliation, many of them. General Dunford is supposed to have expressed some caution about the possible repercussions of a military strike, but according to news reports, it's also Fox News anchor Tucker Carlson who is believed to have echoed or reinforced perhaps the doubts that the president himself may have had about getting into a spiral
Sure.
of escalation without intending to do so.
Sure.
But so for the moment, at least things have not come to a head.
Right.
But the risks remain high.
Right. Right. We'll talk about the risks in just a bit, and we'll talk about how close we are to a war in West Asia. But before that, Wailawat, who wants war and who doesn't want war really in West Asia?
Well, there are so many wanted the war, especially the war hawks in the White House themselves. Like you have Pompeo, you have John Bolton. These are the two main causes of the trouble in the region. In fact, even you have the Arab countries where the Saudis and the UAE and also the Israelis pushing Trump into a kind of an adventure in Iran. And I think these are the sense of wisdom maybe prevailed, but I think the Pentagon was right in saying no attack, because military to military understand the consequences of a war in the region, and it won't be easy for the United States nor for the region. In fact, it will be in a total chaos and turmoil, and if this war have started, I think the whole target of military bases within the range of the Iranian, which is all under the range of the Iranian gunships and the ballistic missile, would have been in flames. So therefore, there was a very strong message went from the Iranian that we had seen two planes. One plane was the unmanned airplane which we shot down. The second one, we gave them a warning and they left our space, and that's why we didn't shoot it. And there were 35 Marines on it. So therefore, the American understand the messages. And in fact, Iranian, what was worrying the American was that they were able to track the moment the flight took off from Dubai throughout the journey. And when you ask the Iranian expert on this, they will tell you that we are able to man 400 spies of the United States within the region throughout our history. So they are knowing every steps of the American movement of the troops in the region, and they have recorded, documented and presented to their allies, the Russian and the Chinese, who told the American also, do not go for a war, because this is not going to be easy for the United States. You know, you remember the war on Iraq, you mentioned it. It took the Americans 60 days when we were embedded with the American troops. It took us 60 days in Kuwait till they were able to build up the troops to invade Iraq. So Americans were not even preparing for invasion of Iraq. Therefore, kind of a skirmish or an adventure or a limited target will not be an easy thing, because you can sell weapons, but you cannot sell wars.
Right. All right, Professor. Dr. Awad is calling it an adventure. How close are we to a war-like situation, but to a war in West Asia?
Frank, you have to see Donald Trump's way of conducting diplomacy in last 2+ years. His tweets, his words are often very, very aggressive. But if you see his practice, whether it is Iran, Venezuela, China, anyone, it's far more cautious. So I don't see that in case of Iran, where his even words are becoming far more cautious. You remember after the drone was shot down, he only called it a big mistake, and even went to the extent that it was not perhaps intended, he said, to the television interview. So I think it's a distinction between words and deeds that one has to take care of. Second, there is no such trigger as was earlier in case of 91 Iraqi attack on Kuwait, or 2003 in the 9/11 background. So there is no such immediate trigger where mandate can be given to Donald Trump to start another war in the Middle East. More important, Democrats, there is no bipartisan support in this case. So Democrats are saying that you are likely to slip into a dangerous war. Some even in Republicans are asking for caution. So I don't think he has a mandate to do it. And unlike his experience of adventure or misadventure in case of Iraq or even Afghanistan, Iran is a very different ball game here. Because if you look at it, United States has already alienated all its European allies. So there is not going to be desert storm or some kind of a concert of the willing, etc. Possible this time. The only allies that we are talking, and just mention was made of Israel, Saudi Arabia and UAE. I'm not sure how enthusiastic they would be in involving themselves in an actual war. Iran, on the other hand, has, shall we say, proxies in the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen, even some militias in Iraq, Syria. they could harm US interests and personnel across the region. And even today's news, that the foreign ministry spokesperson in Tasneem news agency has clearly said that we will be very firm in giving our reply, and I think that is clearly understood in the United States.
Right.
So certain amount of barbos may continue, I see, and dispatching 1,000 troops and then 1,500 troops is no way you can conduct a war vis-a-vis Iran. So I think
Sure,
it's going to be much more worse than actual escalation of conflict.
Because it's going to be a prolonged process. It's not something that is going to get over in a week.
And then he's getting into presidential elections.
Sure. So, Ambassador, so what would a war really achieve in West Asia if the United States wants to go into war?
I think it would not be an easy exercise. It would be a prolonged process. And if they are looking at regime change, I am not sure what the consequences will be. Because even in Iraq, you saw that the war led to the rise of ISIS, which posed a very serious threat to the United States. And eventually the US had to take on ISIS itself within the region because of its activities against Western personnel and including civilians. Therefore in Iran there's no guarantee what the outcome is going to be, except that the US could really get trapped into a very prolonged war of attrition. So I don't think that there would be many voices really looking at seriously at an all-out war. Limited military strikes is what perhaps was on the table,
but that
can blow up. There's no guarantee that it won't spiral. So I think for the moment they will continue to go by sanctions. They have said they are going to reimpose sanctions, which were suspended on account of lack of Iranian action with regard to money laundering and terrorist financing. They are going to use the Financial Action Task Force to put Iran on notice on these counts and reimpose the sanctions which were suspended by the FATF.
Right.
So I think that they will rely for the moment on economic pressure and racketing up the military rhetoric, but perhaps will not use it.
Sure. Wailawat, who's to blame for the present situation?
Well, I think we need to look at the situation not in isolation. In fact, we have to see the whole chronology of the problem within West Asian affairs. You know, the regime change policy that the United States have started in different parts of the Arab world, which even himself, President Trump, have acknowledged that his previous administration been active in these lines, and we should stop, and he was keen on stopping it. Then we have seen the Arab Spring, where we have seen all this problem. Then the Saudi-led coalition war on Yemen, where the American and the European are fully supporting the Saudi in its war, and they're selling them banned arm, and they're using it, and they're calling themselves upholding the human rights issues and the support of human values, which I am so surprised that you're allowing all this bombing and more than 100,000 people got killed in the poorest and the poor of the world countries there. So if you look at the Bab al-Mandeb passage and you look at Hormuz, Strait of Hormuz, we have to see the global trade and the oil passage from this one. So United States recessions of influence in the region have created this kind of a policy within the United States that we should be the policeman of this part. United States look at the Gulf region as its own custodian. Is the custodian of the West Asia, a custodian of the GCC country, where it feels that this is their assets. In fact, the United States have not even shied away from threatening the USSR that they are ready to use a nuclear weapon if they take their influence in this part of the world. So if we see the American interest, fine, fair enough. If your interest is to retain and preserve, you should not go for wars and you creating more battlefield in the region so you can sell arms. You are able to sell $450 billion arm to the Saudis, but you are unable to protect them from the hand-thrown manned aeroplane, and they are attacking within Saudi Arabia. Then what kind of sophisticated weapon are you giving them? Secondly, you are able also to be shot down by $2,600 cost of a rocket to shoot down the $220 million unmanned American aeroplane. That's also another indication that your industry not in a good shape. So therefore, to create more zone, to create more war in the region does not solve the problem of West Asia. There is oil, the whole peace and security internationally will be affected because this is a threat not only for the oil supply, not only for the global trade supply, but also for the human suffering in the region. How many countries have suffered in this region? Look at the chronology of American invasion. Within this part of the world, you see the mess they have created, whether it is in Afghanistan, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Syria, in Libya, in Algeria now, in Sudan, in Yemen, name it, and they are there. So therefore, how long can the world suffer because of these mongers, warmongers? We need to put an end to this. It has to be reshaping of the global world order to see that there is peace prevail in this part of the world. Otherwise, who is suffering the maximum? India will suffer, China will suffer, Japan will suffer, South Korea will suffer. All the Eastern nations, which is the giant economy just now coming up in the Asian century, will be the most suffering country if any war break in the region.
Right.
So therefore, we need to be proactive in preventing wars, not only by telling the United States that you can solve the problem in the region, you can still have your interest in the region, but in equal footing. You can't just do the cowboy or you do the policeman in the region and you wanted to achieve your aims. Thirdly, which is more important, if you know, Iran was the policeman of the United States and the West during the Shah time. They toppled a democratically elected regime, Muhammad Mossadegh 1953. They toppled him because they wanted not to nationalize their oil. So the American came to this region and the moment the Shah was toppled, then this government came, they started the anti-Iranian policy toward the region because Iraq has suffered at the hand of the United States and Israel in the region. But if you look at the war, the irony of the matter, it was the only two countries who supported Iran in selling them the arm during the war with Iraq. And that's what the Iraq Contras, we know that the gate, Iran gate, which has selling arms in its market. So making sanction, as the Iranians say, it's an economic terrorism. And also at the same time, you are also making this sanction to increase the do number ka kaam, which is the black market.
Right.
So therefore, there will be beneficiaries of any war or any tension in this region.
Sure. So what are the implications then? We'll come to the implications for India and what all of this means for India in just a bit. But what does it mean for the world, Professor?
I think it clearly shows that military-industrial complex plays an enormous influence on how politics is organized among states. And if there has to be any stakeholder in wanting to have wars, military-industrial complex would be wanting the wars. So Desert Storm, for example, was often described as a museum of American technology that obviously led to several world orders that followed from there. So there could be clearly important stakeholders wanting this to go to brinkmanship. Of course, we often hear Mike Pompeo or sort of national security advisor John Bolton making extremely harsh comments. John Pence, of course, is expected to make his speech anytime. He will speak on perhaps Hong Kong, and also he will bring in Iran, I suppose, in his speeches. He's been also fairly sharp, speech maker in that sense. So there are individuals, and I think they represent certain amount of constituencies and interests. The immediate implications, as was just mentioned, is going to be closure of Strait of Hormuz. Iran can clearly block it. And I think that obviously means that economies of both Gulf countries that are main suppliers of oil, and also economies in the East, as he just mentioned, who are rapidly growing economies, would immediately have to suffer. So that is going to cause not just a regional chaos, but I think much larger global chaos, and could see downtrends in global growth rates, downtrends in global economy. Already, United States-China war, as IMF says, is shrinking economy this year by 0.5%. You could add on to that another certain percentage. So I think it's going to really have much more economic impact. And these kind of gradual, sporadic strikes here and there is what we will see happening. I don't frankly think that United States will take such a misadventure of actually attacking Iran this time.
Sure. All right. Ambassador, there's a lot at stake for India really in all of this, because all of our oil really, our energy security is from that particular region. So what are the implications for India?
Well, India is heavily dependent on energy imports from the region, including from Iran. And some of our major refineries are really geared to Iranian oil. So there are costs for us in reducing the amount of oil that we are taking from Iran. At the same time, we have longer term strategic interests in Iran, including the port of Chabahar. But weighed against this is also the strategic relationship we have with the United States. And for India, I think we'll have to balance between these interests very carefully. There's an economic cost we pay each time our energy supplies are impacted. For instance, we were getting oil from Venezuela, which again, has been impacted because of the US pressure to stop oil imports from Venezuela. Now you were getting from Iran, and you were getting these again through rupee payments. So it saved you precious foreign exchange and helped your balance of payments. All this is going to be impacted. So we would really hope that at the end of the day, diplomacy should be given a chance.
Right.
I think the British Foreign Secretary is already perhaps in Iran. I suppose the Europeans will try to explore what the possibilities would be of diplomacy going forward, because they also have a lot at stake.
At stake, yeah, sure. Talking about implications, Abad, one thing that has immediately happened is United Airlines has suspended its flights from the United States to India because those flights fly over Iran airspace. There are several other airlines as well who have decided not to fly over Iranian airspace. So this is an immediate implication really as far as the whole situation in West Asia is concerned, and the airline industries all across the world are already suffering.
I think that's a part of the strategy of the United States to imply its sanction against Iran. Started with the oil, then started with the petrochemical, started with the air, their own export. Now it is the airspace where the revenue can come. So I think the Iranians have already made it clear that there is nothing to worry. The airspace is open, so the American can, or the Emirati have started this, that we should stop. I think this is a tactical pressure on Iran, which is not going to work. Actually, the people of the American are forgetting the culture of Asia. And to understand the culture of even Iranian, you need to talk to them. You need to respect them. You need to sit down and an equal footing talk. Don't think that by showing this kind of macho muscles and you can do and against their Iranian can never bend down. It's their strategy. Their foreign policy is based like their knitting of a carpet. It may take years, but they will give you a beautiful carpets. So this is the same foreign policy they have been following. Give me for the last 300 years where the Iranians have really invaded any country. No, there is no invasion of any country in the region. So therefore, I think the American has to understand the culture of the region. They have to talk to them. There is more commonality between the United States interest and Iran rather than the adversary. But if President Trump will continue listening to his war hawks and to our neighbor Israel, it will suffer a lot, because this is not going to be an easy outcome. Either the United States Bolton has to resign, or they will nuke Iran. There is no other solution. And that's God forbidden if it happened. That's what the wider perspective, if we look at the Asia Pacific, where the American also thinking of North Korea and China and the future conflict, then we will be having more problem in the world to come. So the Cold War era is already started with the United States policy under the Trump administration, which is going to continue because they're likely that he will be elected. So therefore, in this part of the world, what you need is people to sit down across the table and solve the problem. What you have created a mess in Afghanistan, and now you're calling regional players to come and discuss Afghanistan. It's a similar fashion. Let us prevent the war in the region. Let conflict diplomacy take its own course, and let us stop this war in this region. I think there are good feelers within the European Union, which they have already, as Ambassador Amira said. There is the French, there is the German, there are also the British, where everybody is going forward, because America cannot fight a war alone with the Iranian. They want to rally their allies. Right. If the allies rally with the United States in preventing a war, is much better for all of us. If not, then we are heading for more chaos to come, because I don't see any near future end of the war on Yemen, neither in Syria or Iraq, nor in Libya or Algeria, or even in Sudan. So therefore, if you wanted to continue with the chaotic situation, the anarchy you created, then we are heading for more trouble in the region.
All right. Closing comment now from you, Professor, on what's likely to happen and what's the best way forward.
I think United States Federal Aviation Authority has already issued an order requesting aviators not to use that space, and I think that will also be taken into account by various airlines, not only American Airlines. The fact that in last 7 weeks 6 vessels have been attacked in the region would affect outgoing and incoming flights for India, both in terms of the region and beyond to Europe and North America. I think more important would be that even if we have filled in certain amount of reserve oil for us, it's not going to last very long, and already the prices are shooting up, and that is going to have a clear negative impact to all other sectors in Indian economy. At danger, I think, is this careful walking between United States and Iran, and we have had occasions when we have kind of fallen on the side of United States and have gone against Iraq in certain cases. Mike Pompeo is going to come here this week. I think a certain amount of pressure will be built on India to take sides, and of course that is a difficult challenge for India now, to make sure that we are not seen taking either of the sides, and we are able to sort of calibrate our policy based on our national interest. In the long run, I see it's a time for India to redefine also as to where it stands, and in that sense being able to articulate its own vision and not just react to what others are doing. And I think that's where we have to really make sure that we do not clearly sort of appear to be working under pressure, but working under on vision and following our own national interests.
All right. With that, then, I'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. What's coming out of the discussion today is the fact that a war is not going to do anyone good, and India should be careful, really treading a tight balance going forward between the United States and Iran, and we need to safeguard our own interests first. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.